Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Judiskt-kultur i Sverige and Konstakademien. I'm Lizzie Shea, director of Judiskt-kultur i Sverige, and we are extremely happy to have a huge crowd here. I'm not surprised at all after the good reviews for this J Talks with Joshua Cohen. I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Joshua in New York a few months ago, and it was a ball. You're going to have a good time with him tonight, I promise. The Netanyahus in Swedish were thrilled that Tranan took upon itself, Johannes, to bring it to the Swedish audience, and we're very grateful to Gabriel Itkesnap, as usual, for sensible and excellent translation. So I just want to say that this talk will be about 1 hour long, after which there will be book signing and a reception. Join us for a glass of wine. We are happy also for the first time on our stage anyway to have Björn of Klein, a journalist at Dagens Nyheter. So welcome, Björn. And welcome, Josh. Josh is going to fly tomorrow to Gothenburg, and he's going to be very busy at the book fair, seminars, talks, and interviews. So this is the first time at Judiskt-kultur i Sverige, and not the last one. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the evening. Next week, after the book fair, I invite you all. We're going to have a big celebration here, or not, but we will have anyway a meeting here on the 2nd of October with two wonderful authors, Dani Shapiro from the United States, from New York, and Hila Blum from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem, actually from Israel. And it's really J-Talks time 2. We are concluding the book fair with these two marvelous authors. If you want to come, just come. It will be a big celebration with a nice Israeli buffet outside. So the 2nd of October at 7 o'clock, and just register at info@judiskultur.se. I wish you a good evening, and I leave the floor. Josh, Björn, welcome.
Thank you. You're fresh off the boat. You landed a couple of hours ago. You were up 30 plus hours and you're drinking scotch.
Yeah, I landed 1 hour and 20 minutes ago. Yeah.
And you've been up 30 hours.
Yeah, about.
Impressed by your stamina.
I'm here.
So last year, the Netanyahus received the Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest literary honor in the United States. The review's been glorious. It's a loved book. But it was a bumpy ride. It was rejected not once or twice or 3 times or 4 times, but actually 24 times, you told James Wood at Harvard. What happened? At what point did you think about putting it back in the drawer?
Well, the problem with putting something back in the drawer is you need something else. It's easy to put it back in the drawer, but you have to know what's next to put something back in the drawer. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad book. I don't know. I think that there were a few things sort of conspiring against it. One was that it was written really at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns in New York, and then it kind of went out to publishers at that time. And this was a book that the publishers, at least the publishers in the initial publishers in the United States, were afraid required a large legal review. Lawyers, I assume lawyers in Sweden have the same reputation of lawyers everywhere else. Just assuming that.
What's the reputation?
Well, in my world is that lawyers lawyers just a code word for frustrated writer. And every lawyer I've ever spoken with, whether it's like a lawyer about a book thing or like I'm trying to rent an apartment, like a bad apartment too, and there's a lawyer, at some point in the conversation it always comes back to that the lawyer has a book in the drawer, right?
Right.
And could I read it? And do I have any ideas about it? And, maybe if I improve this character or this, and so lawyers, though, who would otherwise be very, very eager to write, legal opinions in lieu of novels or whatever, in this case, filed, internal memos to the publishers that warned of possibilities of legal action, especially when it comes to selling foreign rights. The defamation, slander, and so on laws in the UK, for example, and being very different from the ones in the United States. And so the lawyers, in their in their literary ambition, helped destroy it. Yeah, not the first thing that lawyers have destroyed, parenthetically, but yeah.
And were they right? I mean, are there risks? I guess the subject matter is the risk here.
Look, I didn't do any favors for myself. I didn't help myself by telling the lawyers that I wanted to get sued. I was trying to explain to these people that, in fact, the best thing that could possibly happen, not just to the book, but to my life, would be sued by a head of state. I mean, this is, you can't pay for that kind of advertising. So, they just sort of nodded, and I did, which I didn't understand. I was like, look, it's going to make a lot of money for you guys. It'll make a lot of money for me. It'll be great. Everyone will, let's try and get sued. I think that, the general sense of legal trouble is deeply exaggerated when it comes to culture. Right? I mean, I think that and to be, serious for a second, it really does throw into relief how much of the mechanisms of publication, distribution, so much of the culture industry is actually on the side of money and not on the side of art, right? And it's all about, what is going to happen in-house and what is this going to cost us and so on and so forth. And but, nothing ended up happening, at least in the States, at the end of the day. And then, what happened in Israel was fun.
What happened in Israel?
Lots of things. No, this book was introduced into a defamation lawsuit that actually Netanyahu has so many lawsuits against him. He actually maybe decided it was time to file a lawsuit against someone else. And he filed a lawsuit against Ehud Olmert, who was the former prime minister, who was formerly also mayor of Jerusalem, who had called Netanyahu and his wife, Sarah Netanyahu, had called them mentally ill. And Netanyahu, basically said, the last time I checked, you weren't a licensed physician. You can't make that diagnosis. I'm going to sue you. And, as part of Israel is a former British colony, follows the British, definitions and standards of defamation, meaning that someone suing for it has to prove material damages, that they have been prevented from earning a living, which was odd because Netanyahu was not prevented from being prime minister for being called, mentally ill. And then the way you defend against that charge is you essentially turn the courtroom into a circus, and you prove that that this is not the worst thing that someone has said about you, right? And so, brought into the trial were quotations from opinion pieces in the New York Times, from the Guardian, and then this book, which had just won the Pulitzer, to prove that calling someone mentally ill was not the worst thing that had been done. And this suit was eventually found in Netanyahu's favor, actually. So. Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means that, there were 3 different counts in the suit, and a few of them stood and a few of them fell. It essentially said that the speech of a former prime minister holds different weight than the speech of an author, which I agree with. I'm not in charge of anything. I've never been in charge.
Did you
of
sell a
anything.
lot of copies?
Then again, Ehud Olmert also went to jail. So, I don't know.
Did you sell a lot of copies in Israel?
Yeah, but a lot of copies in Israel is like 5. Sure, yeah. Yeah, we sold pretty. I mean, Israel and Sweden have many things in common. I have been in Sweden for an hour, so I don't but the sense I get is the first thing that I've discovered in common between Sweden and Israel is that a lot of the book buying public can read and does read in English. Mm-hmm. And which I think is a tragedy. I think that's, and I don't just say that to support a publisher. I think that the art of translation really is, an art that's deeply, underappreciated, and that it's not just taking a photograph of a text from one language and developing it into an image in another language. That there's an entire process that that distills something to a native sensibility. That you might gain some things by reading the original, but I think that you lose the immediate connection to the language of your soul, and so I think I sold more English language copies in Israel than Hebrew language copies, which is in my mind a tragedy, not just because I'm friendly with the translator and I work with him on it, but because there are nuances that I work to help put into that translation. Just like there are nuances in the Swedish translation that particularize effects that I think otherwise would be lost.
I'm not going to dwell on the rejections, but I'm curious if
I did, so you can. It's fine.
If that fact sort of affected your relationship to the novel, do you feel for it? Does it have a sweet smell of revenge still, or?
Yeah, I mean, sure. But I think that in a way, it's all of American publishing, or not all of it, but about 80% of it is owned by, German conglomerates, right? So, I don't know. I feel like a lot of my life is revenge against German interests. I don't know. I think that it's very hard to feel the true satiation of revenge against a kind of a faceless multinational corporation, But there definitely is the thought that I've spared their lives. Like they live because I've surrendered the claim to them, at my mercy.
So this is a book about. It's set in the '60s in a provincial college town in upstate New York, although you're not allowed to say upstate New York.
Yeah.
And Benjamin Netanyahu's father comes there as an historian to teach, and this happened, and you were told about this passage in time about Harold Bloom was the major literary scholar in post-war America. I'm trying to find an equivalent in Sweden. It's hard to find one. Maybe Ingmar Bergman. You were summoned to Harold Bloom as a young Jewish writer. Why was that, and how was that?
You could fit like 9 Bergmans physically into Harold Bloom. He was so large. He was just one like physically large person, but large in many ways. Harold, toward the end of his life, wanted to write a memoir, and he had known pretty much everyone interesting in the 20th century who didn't run a country, right? And he had gotten to the point where he didn't want to trust anyone at Yale, which is where he had taught for a very long time. And he had read and written, actually his last essay about a novel was about a novel of mine called Book of Numbers. And, he decided, because he'd written something nice about me, that he could just say, come up here. And I did, and I went up there. And he wanted to kind of dictate his memoirs and kind of put them together. His mind was completely intact, and it was, this is a terrifyingly accurate memory, but his body was failing, and he couldn't type. And so I sat with him, and he would tell crazy stories about going swimming naked with Derrida, and
playing chess with Nabokov.
Playing chess with Nabokov, right? I mean, just amazing stories. And he came from that generation that was the first generation that had television. And what I really kind of felt from knowing my grandparents a little bit is that the people for whom television was new, it came into their world, they would keep it on all day silently in the background. Like it's a wallpaper, It's just, I don't know what it is about that relationship with television, but it was just always on. It was almost like it was a miracle that there was always something when you pressed the button. So let's just watch it. And so, so he always had CNN on mute. And, but you could read the headlines and whatever coming across.
Sure.
And then Netanyahu comes on the screen. And we're in the middle of talking about something else. And Harold says, I met that guy. And I was like, okay, sure. And I'm thinking, like, did you meet him in the 90s when he was the UN ambassador? When? And he goes, no, I think he was like 10 years old when his father came to interview for a job at Cornell. And because I was the only Jew in the faculty, they made me take him around. So I said, oh, tell me about it. So he told me like 2 sentences, but he wasn't interested in it because he wasn't the hero of that story, right? And then Jean Bloom, who's still, God bless her, she's still alive. She's in her 90s. His wife, she came in the room. And of course she said, Harold, that's not how it went. Let me tell you the story. This is actually what went on, And, and then they're arguing about something that happened, 60-some years ago. And then he died. And I had to wanted to write something for a memorial service they had for him. And I went back to listen to the recordings. And that little anecdote, 2 sentences, just stuck out with me. He said, what the hell was that like, because the figure of Benzion Netanyahu was, he was a name I knew, but I knew nothing about him.
This is the father of Benjamin.
Yeah. Yeah. So I started writing it.
But you get all these stories, wonderful stories, and you choose this one. What was it that stuck?
I think that there are, I think that we encounter stories or anecdotes or where we are ourselves characters in other people's stories as a course of, living. But I think it's very rare, and it's usually much longer in retrospect, that you realize that a situation that you were in or a narrative that you were involved in is in some way, metaphoric or an allegory, right? Allegories tend to be, we think about allegories as, as religious art is like an allegory, right? Something is an ancient story, like a parable or a fable, but we don't live those, right? We think that's something in the past. And I realized that this was some sort of an allegory or a parable for something, and I wanted to figure out what it meant. There was also a little bit of a sort of a torn biographical element with me, where I think I grew up partially in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Trumpstown, and an island off the coast of New Jersey, and it's very close to Philadelphia. It's where everyone from Philadelphia goes during the summer, and they park in our driveway and ruin our lives during the summer. And so Netanyahu was sort of always a presence, right? Because he had grown up largely outside of Philadelphia, kind of in suburban Philadelphia. And he had come to my school. I went to a very small school. And
now you're talking about Bibi Netanyahu.
Bibi Netanyahu. He could come to my school, right, when I was a kid. And I always accepted the fact that, even though it's changed in recent years, lots have changed in recent years, but his accent has changed. He used to have like a Philadelphia accent in English, and I never really questioned why the Prime Minister of Israel had a Philadelphia accent. It's just when you're a kid, it's just like, okay, that's who that is. And I'd never understood what brought him to the United States, why his family was there, what were the historical forces and circumstances that brought him there. And that felt to me very close to home.
And this is Harold Bloom dies in 2019.
Yeah.
That's when Bibi is struggling for power in Israel. Mm-hmm. So when you start writing, it is against the backdrop political turmoil in Israel.
But it's always political turmoil in Israel. I mean, I just, sure. I mean, I was thinking more about, honestly, about the 1950s, right? I mean, this book's 59 to 60, right, is kind of when it's set. And which is still an era, and I say this is obviously someone, I hope obviously, someone who wasn't alive then, though, though I've gone grayer. I think that this was an era that that we don't think about that often. In the United States, it's a period of post-World War II triumphalism and consumerism and contentment that they've made a lot of TV shows about, where people are wearing really nice clothes and driving really good cars, right? And I think from the Israeli perspective, it is entirely a narrative of building a state. And I kind of wanted to depart from this idea that the 1950s was a time where Jews, basically all throughout the world, were engaged in becoming something else, right? They were, in the United States, there was this idea of a first attempt to assimilate into a white mainstream. Jews in the Arab world, with the establishment of the State of Israel, were, either kicked out or made to feel unwelcome, and emigrated to Israel. And Israel was a place, obviously, for survivors of the Holocaust. And all of this whole brew was essentially given over to crystallizing a new definition of their identity. So it's a decade during which you keep the word Jewish, but the content of it fundamentally changes everywhere. And that, to me, was very germane to whatever news I was seeing. And I also knew that part of the perverse aspect of the book is that Netanyahu I'm sorry to ruin it for anyone, if anyone, still buy the book if you're interested in it, but I'm sorry, But Netanyahu, the Bibi Netanyahu, appears in the book for like 5 pages, and he's 10 years old, and he mostly watches his older brother have sex, or try to. And Yoni deserves it. And but the real Netanyahu in it is the father,
right,
who for me was the forgotten figure that's the key to so much of understanding who his son is.
When he came as an historian, but he was really a lobbyist.
Yeah, I mean, he was really just a ruined guy. I mean, he's born in Warsaw, and his father, brings the family to Palestine and basically drops them off and says, deal with it. And so he grows up, in Palestine, and he becomes a student in one of the first 4 classes of the Hebrew University. And he wants to become a historian of Europe, right? He wants to get into European history. But he's doing this at a time when every refugee professor from Europe needs a job and will work for nothing. So why would you hire a guy who is locally educated when you could get someone from the Sorbonne, when you could get someone from Friedrich Wilhelm in Munich, when you could get, you're getting all of these scholars. And so, in a way, the immigrants were taking his jobs, right? He gravitates toward the circle of Jabotinsky, of so-called revisionist Zionism, and becomes a polemicist and an editorialist, never a journalist, but kind of a rabble-rouser for a number of right-wing periodicals, and then essentially, is engaged with, is enough involved in terrorist and quasi-terrorist activities, so that when the British take away Jabotinsky's residency permit and they don't let him back into Palestine, he is also blacklisted. And so if he wants to earn a living, he has to go abroad. So during the most consequential decade of I would say, all of Jewish history since maybe the year 70 and the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, right? Like a truly consequential decade. Benzion Netanyahu is not dying in Europe. He's not being murdered in Poland. And he's not building his state in Palestine. He's living in suburban Long Island and suburban Philadelphia, burning with resentment that he is not allowed to play a role in history. He is a historian who's not allowed to play a role in history. And he raises his children with this idea of resentment and that their fate in life is to redeem his failures.
And how much of his ideas lives on in the family today?
I mean, I think totally. I mean, I think that there's 2 points to make with that. One is that you know, the idea that there's always an existential threat against the Jewish people that requires eternal vigilance. You know, absolutely that is something that Bibi Netanyahu kind of, you know, you hear that every time he says Iran. At the same time, one of the problems that I had to wrestle with in this book is that the revisionists were right in a really horrible way. And there's one thing about knowing your enemy, but it's another thing about being empathetic and understanding an enemy. You know, essentially, you know, though there are many gradations of quote-unquote revisionist Zionism, the essential point of the Jabotinsky circle is you don't wait until the great powers of the world give you a state. You don't wait until the British say, okay, you can have this country. You don't wait until, you know, America gets along with the UK and says, sure, have it. You take it. And the reason why you take it is to save the Jews of Europe. And so the revisionists who lost and were not involved in any of these early Israeli governments, they are the labor governments, Mapai governments, that's the early governments of Israel. These guys are totally on the outs. They have the sense that the state of Israel was founded with the blood of 6 million Jews on their hands because they did not successfully make it a place for emigration that saved the Jews of Europe. And it was that sense of failure that Benzion Netanyahu walks around with, that the revisionist project failed because it failed to resettle everyone who was murdered. And it's sort of impossible to understand the subsequent inheritance of the revisionist tradition, especially as it's seen in Bibi Netanyahu, without understanding that those are the roots. That, you know, that Jabotinsky is running around Europe in 1938 trying to raise a Jewish army to fight the Nazis, which is, right? And so there's a sense of having failed a constituency of a state that doesn't yet exist. And that underlies a lot of the revisionist tactics and humiliations.
Is Benzion Netanyahu successful in the US in his project?
I mean, successful. He raised 3 kids. One of them became prime minister. The other one's a hero, and the third one's a radiologist. You know, it's not bad. You know, I mean, successful. I mean, I know a lot of people who would consider that to be very successful. Did he know because he wasn't, you know, because he wasn't prime minister himself? You know, because he was a man with a certain amount of ego and a certain amount of appetite. I don't know. I mean, I think that, you know, he was a lobbyist. He turned into a lobbyist, though Bibi definitely exaggerated his importance as like the father of America-Israel relations. And, I think that he, you know, would not have described himself as successful, except through his children. And you know, I think that, you know, there are, you know, you probably know this better than I do. You said you have a kid, I don't have a kid, but it's like, is your child's success enough to make you say, okay, I surrender? I don't know. Definitely not for my father.
What does he do?
What? My father was an Atlantic City casino lawyer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
The book is dedicated to Harold Bloom, but the character that's based on Harold Bloom is nothing like Harold Bloom.
Right.
He's bleaker, more mediocre,
Yeah.
A lesser man.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that way?
One, because I really did love Harold, and I'm not the kind of writer that can write about my own life and the people I know. That's just not my, I'd rather, the people I like me. And I'll just find something else to write about. I think also because Harold is, if I wrote the truth about Harold, no one would believe it. It would be the most unbelievable shit in the book. People would just say you're making that up. And I mean, besides the fact that he would just, you would have a competing character with Benzion Netanyahu that would be these two men who were just having these like dick contests, basically, just being egomaniacs and whatever. But Harold was, he had an eidetic memory, like a completely photographic memory. He would read, your book, and then he would be able to quote from memory 20 pages at a stretch, like without a mistake. And it was just one of these absolute, I mean, I don't want to call it a freak of nature, but it felt freakish. It was, he was a person who, in a lot of ways, the history of assimilation or integration, or however you would want to put it, and I think there are many political valences to how it's described. It's like the mediocrities come later, right? The reason why Harold was hired to teach at Yale, which is a fairly anti-Semitic place when he began, was because he was this genius freak, because he could do things that other people in the faculty couldn't. And it was after hiring him and then a few other people that, you can get the mediocre people who are currently on the faculty of Yale University. I don't know, but he, what made him accepted was because he was so exceptional. And, he was a kid from the Bronx who didn't learn English until, later in his childhood. His language was Yiddish, who then convinced people that he was the English language expert on romantic poetry and Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he found that very entertaining,
I love how you describe him towards the end. I'm just going to read a few sentences, and in Swedish actually. Efter visst trugande strömmade historierna fram. Han berättade dem med den där högfrekventa nasala rösten. En Bronx-grabbs föreställning om hur en lärd brittisk mans dialekt lät. Samtidigt som han spottade saliv, slurpade i sig vatten, svalde bitar av tabletter och remsor av vitfisk som han först la ut i lika rikliga mängd på rågbrödsskivor som på skivor av chokladbabka. You had to run to Russian Daughters to get him whitefish when you ran up there.
Yeah, and then he would put it on like a chocolate babka, which was just the weirdest combination. And then you would wonder if he even knew that he was eating whitefish on it. Was, yeah.
But one of his most famous theories is that writing is sort of a generational struggle. Mm-hmm. You have to sort of fight the older generation to find your true original voice. And I guess this is also your attempt to find your voice within sort of a Jewish American style of writing.
Yeah, now we're getting to the real subject of this book. That's a good, no, you're right. I mean, look, I think about this because I have to do this, with all respect, Lizzie, like I have to do this thing in Gothenburg, whenever, tomorrow, someday after this. And it's like, and the panel is like, Jewish, blah, 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 Philip Roth. And it's just like, fuck you, it's just like, and so, Harold was a friend of Roth's, and like a very close friend. And, I knew that coming of age when I, born when I'm born and living the life that I live, being where I'm from, that I could live to be 200 years old. I could live, forever. But the last words that I would hear on my deathbed would be Philip Roth. and understanding Harold's theory of influence, right, as probably as best formulated in a very famous book of his, The Anxiety of Influence, that was a book that I took seriously, because it's about how do you deal with what has been written before you. Does it make you not want to write, or in Harold's theory, or does it make you try to destroy what came before you, right? The idea is that you either become subservient to a tradition or you oppose it. And I always thought, with all respect to Harold, that was, it's a very Freudian thesis. It really applies, psychoanalytical thinking to the idea of influence, right? Killing your father, like that kind of thing. And I resented that was my choice. And one of the greatest criticisms I have, though I understand why it might not be valid in certain ways, of Roth's generation, which is the first, let's say, assimilated generation, beginning of the assimilated generation of American Jewish fiction, is that outside of Yiddish, right? Outside of Yiddish, not in English, not in Hebrew, you don't find any writing about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, really published in English until the late 60s, early 70s, and meaning serious novels, writers about that, and in Hebrew about the same. You see it in Yiddish, but you don't see it in Hebrew and you don't see it in English. And a lot of it could be it takes a long time to assimilate that trauma. A lot of it can be it's one of these things that you wouldn't want to presume to write about if you hadn't been there, and if you had been there, you speak Yiddish probably. But the point is that for almost 2 decades after the Holocaust, there is no writing about it by the most famous Jewish writers that are out there. At the same time, you don't really have, outside of Israel, which has a certain almost socialist realist relationship to promoting its early statehood, you don't find from the largest Jewish diaspora of the United States any writing about Israel until you get to Leon Uris's Exodus, right, which is already like deep into the 60s. And which is weird. So a country's been around for 20-something years, and Jews outside of it don't write about it. And this Holocaust, which killed millions of people and affected people from tons of countries, you're not writing about it outside of a Jewish language. And so my own reaction to this anxiety of influence was I said, okay, Philip Roth, great. Philip Roth's first book, Goodbye Columbus, was published in 1959, right? What is that book about? It's about 2 people at a country club in New Jersey trying to have sex. That's what it's about. I'm going to write a Philip Roth novel set in Philip Roth's year of 1959, but I'm going to write exactly about the 2 things that Jews of his generation completely missed, or repressed, or weren't able to process: the Shoah and Israel. And this would be my revenge.
It's quite a revenge. In what way is it a Philip Roth novel, though?
Because so many of his books take on the transition between the 50s and the 60s, right? I mean, he himself is a child of the 50s into the 60s, right? Someone who becomes famous right at the cusp of the counterculture, but yet had a few books in the beginning that were very much written toward a conformist 1950s spirit. Mm-hmm. He was too old to be a hippie, but he was happy to have sex. Kind of like, no acid, yes threesomes, like that kind of thing. So, and no acid, yes threesomes is very 1950, like right on that cusp. And I think in that indulgence misses out on the true politics of the moment. I mean, Roth doesn't really become political in his writing until Watergate, until Richard Nixon. My interactions with him really began where, a friend of mine when I was like 20 years old, walks me by this apartment, this is after September 11th, and points at a window. In the window of this apartment on the Upper West Side is an American flag. And he says, that's Roth's apartment. And I always thought about that afterwards because I don't know a single writer of my generation who would put an American flag in their window, right? But that is very, very much of, you know, a Roosevelt Democrat kid who then came up and got enough of the 50s to believe in the benevolence and greatness of the United States. And then having that troubled by the counterculture, which was completely the opposite of the way that I was raised, right? There was none of that youthful optimism that Roth had for, you know, a few decades.
Do you feel that you killed him, Roth?
No, he died. You know, but I do think I was trying to point out to the people who really have an idea about him and not just him, but that era. I mean, there are many writers that I feel closer to Bellow personally, but I think that there is a fundamental misinterpretation of actually how that era, how those writers were accepted. I think in many ways those writers were accepted because they were not writing about the most important subjects. I think those writers were accepted because they were writing about popular, sexy, easy subjects and avoiding very, very hard truths. You know, again, maybe that's easy for me to say, you know, in retrospect, but, you know, Roth, you know, avoids writing about the Holocaust largely, and really only writes about Israel in the Counterlife, already in the 80s, and then Operation Shylock in the 90s. Bellow, I think, is more attuned to it earlier on, but Bellow kind of always had a more European sensibility.
But you feel that that's their duty, that they failed?
I don't know if it's duty. I just think that it's no, I mean, I don't think writers have any duty, but I do think that it's very odd that all of them failed. I mean, you know, like that, it's not an individual failure at that point. It actually speaks to a psychic wall, you know, like inherent in that generation. I mean, you know, one thing that I always think about is, you know, J.D. Salinger helped to liberate Buchenwald.
How so?
He was a soldier. He was an American soldier. He was he was one of the soldiers who came in to liberate Buchenwald. And then, you know, you come home and then you write your, you know, teenage stories of Holden Caulfield telling everyone that they're a phony. And it's always very strange to me, like someone who walked in Buchenwald, liberated it, came out of the war, you know, was on the front lines for a year and a half of the war, comes back to America and writes these sort of teenage stories about, you know, being angry in New York. To me, they're more therapeutic than they are artful in a way.
You grew up in an Orthodox family in Atlantic City. When did you decide to be a writer?
When I realized that I'd grown up in an Orthodox family in New Jersey, so that was probably the thing to do. I was always writing. I mean, I think I only really knew that I was, you know, going to try and make it happen when I was 30 because by that, you know, because up until then it was a hobby. I'd published 3 books, but, you know, I was working as a journalist and I was doing all of these other things to, you know, to survive. But I mean, I published my first book when I was 25 or 26, and so a few years before that, maybe was when I said, okay, this is what I want to do, but it took a while.
And Bibi Netanyahu said under oath that he read it.
He did.
What do you think about it?
I mean, he's a narcissist. Of course he read it. I mean, if someone told me that Bibi Netanyahu wrote a novel about my father, I would read it too. Like, I don't know. I mean, it just, to me, it's very, you know, I think we also think that these people are busier than they are. You know, I mean, these, you know, they have a lot of staff. Yeah.
What would Harold have said about the novel?
What would Harold have said about the novel? You know, he would have said something like, you know, he would have been angry that he was kept out of it, but also very happy that he was kept out of it. So, depending on what day you got him, he would have said both things. He would say, like, how dare you not put me in there, and also thank you. And I would have had to kind of deal with it. I think, yeah. What I like is that Jean's response, his wife's response, this was after, because the book came out after Harold died, and she would call me pretty often when the book was out because she was reading the reviews and she was sort of excited about it, and when a book comes out, if you're lucky, there are a lot of reviews or a few reviews like in like a week's time or 2 weeks' time, and they're all kind of clustered. And then there's the day that happens, which is always, it's the most important day in a writer's life. It's the day that no reviews happen. It's like, because, you have, someone mentions it, there's a couple reviews, and then there's like one Wednesday that happens, no reviews, right? And that's always an interesting day, because it's like, okay, maybe the cycle is over, And we had been talking about some movie stuff, where people wanted to option it, and I said, sure, I don't want to be involved in it, but sure, do it. And I was at one of these meetings, but Jean would call, and I felt like every day I needed to give Jean news, because like she would call me and be like, what's going on? And I would want to give her something. And this one day, there was no reviews, so there was kind of nothing to give her. But I had been in this meeting for a movie thing, and I said, we had this movie meeting, and they're thinking that for someone to play Harold in the movie, they're thinking about Jonah Hill, and you could hear her. She has a really big computer with a really big keyboard that you get when you're older, and you could hear her like typing out the name Jonah Hill, and like return, and then she's looking at it and she says, "Oh, no, Josh, Harold was very good looking." And it's just, that was, yeah. So Jean's response was the perfect one. Get someone good looking to play my husband.
Thank you so much, and good luck in Gothenburg, telling the audience that Liz is fair to fuck Phil Proper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I just wonder about a couple of things, Josh, okay? If we can dwell on a couple of things that you said that sounded very important, but maybe some of the audience, like Jabotinsky, I don't know if anyone doesn't know who Zev Jabotinsky is, and the revisionist, not everybody here is Jewish or oriented with Israeli history.
You guys have Wikipedia in Sweden, right?
Yeah, but I just want to say, does anyone have a question? Because I have a couple. So, does anyone? Yeah, okay, so we take these two questions, and then I do have a question.
I'm curious about your own connection to Jewish life during the Holocaust and in your family, because of the point you made about Philip Roth and American writers avoiding the topic. And I also find that even today, people from America have a different view of what's Jewish and about the Holocaust in Jewishness. It's a long story, that's all.
Josh, what's your story? Tell us. With Philip Roth, with your family, with the Holocaust?
Yeah, well, I think, unlike, and actually, there might be something in your question that explains, I think, some of Roth's, inability or refusal to deal with the topic. It's that, his family had been in the United States from his grandparents' generation, I think from the 1890s or something. And no, my grandparents on one side came as refugees in 42. They were in Portugal in 41, and then 42 came to the States, and then the other side came after the war. And it had been through it all. And, you know, in terms of America having a different view of things, I would just say, I mean, that's true for pretty much everything. But I would also say that, you know, that and I think that this is I don't know how much it's seen abroad, but, you know, the Jewish population of the United States is roughly equal to the Jewish population of Israel. And, you know, it's an enormous and an enormously diverse community with every opinion in the world, you know. I mean, every person has 3 opinions, right? So I think that, you know, in many ways, it's reflective of, it's less reflective of ethnic divides than Israeli society is, because there are less Mizrahim, there are less Jews from Arab countries in the United States, but it is reflective of every aspect of the political spectrum. And insofar as it deals with, you know, its roots are much more emphatically in the European Jewish experience and the Holocaust than Israel's, right? Only because a larger percentage of American families, American Jewish families, have that background. You know, it's a more Ashkenazi European population. And so, you know, and I say that maybe to its detriment, that it you know, it in a way privileges history, you know, and makes it almost a religion.
I've read your book. It's fantastic, and I never laughed as much as I did when I read it. But I would like to know something about Benjamin Netanyahu's mother, because she's also part of that history, and she's really strange. So if you could comment on that.
I mean, I never met her. When Netanyahu was asked in court in the Eller trial if he'd read the book, he said that he had read up until his mother appeared, and then he stopped reading because his mother spoke perfect English in real life, and he did not like the way it was portrayed. I love the idea that he thought his mother spoke perfect English. I think everyone's mother should speak perfect English in their minds, you know. Truthfully, I have the idea that Tzila Netanyahu had a very, very difficult life. I think that, you know, there was a love affair before she met Benzion Netanyahu that went very bad. And she ended up marrying this guy sort of after that. There isn't much written about her, you know, as I think that's the case for a lot of women of that generation, kind of lost to historians. There's not a lot of, there's a little bit of video footage and some very bad, you know, formal photographs, but not really a record. And I tried to get a lot more about her. And speaking to a lot of people who knew Benzion Netanyahu, who taught at Cornell until 1976, until Yoni Netanyahu was killed in the operation in Entebbe to free the hostages in Uganda, at which point he moved back to Israel in 1976. And so there were a lot of people around who still remembered her, but there wasn't really much. So when I really felt that that was going to be a problem, I decided that I was just going to make his mother his wife, as happens. So I just sort of decided to write Sarah Netanyahu, but make his wife his mother. And there's certainly enough about Sarah Netanyahu. Yeah. Well.
I have a question about decisions, a decision that I suppose you made during the writing. And as far as I understand, most of the stories about Benzion Netanyahu are made up. But in one respect, you are very, very, you know, it's important for you to give away his career, to tell us about his career and his historic research, which is of interest, and he was a rather controversial person. So I wonder about that decision, that this specific part of the book is the real stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I felt, you know, I felt bad. You know, I mean, when you're writing fiction about someone who's real, no matter how much you have, you know, I feel like there's a responsibility to the things that he cared about. So, you know, I'll make up dialogue when he's arguing about a car, or when, you know, he's getting into a fight with his kids. But when it came to his scholarship, particularly the way it's represented in two of the letters of recommendation, but really, you know, one of them where it's an account of his ideas, and then in his lecture later on, those were the, you know, those were the pursuits that comprised his life. And so I felt it was incumbent upon me to provide a picture of that. I also think that he is a very interesting scholar. You know, you know, the problems in his scholarship are almost too obvious, right, in the way that he politicizes historical events and relates them across vast gulfs of time and context. But at the same time, he was asking, I think the question that he was asking was a truly profound one that when he was able to formulate it, which is somewhat in the book of the origins of the Inquisition in 15th century Spain, and then in his doctoral dissertation earlier on Abravanel, you know, he asks a question that almost no other historian, I don't think any other historian I know of that time, has asked, which is, what is the shape of history, right? Is history a recurring pattern that where certain historical processes recapitulate in every generation or in every civilization? Or do we believe in a progressivist Enlightenment vision of history, which is that, you know, history gradually gets better, right? Where there is the possibility to improve upon, you know, previous generations, the meliorist view of history. And, you know, I think for him that was a moral question which totally transcends the brief of historians, right? Historians are not, that's not the job of a historian to figure out what is the morality of history. But there was something poignant that he felt that was his mission, and his conclusion, which he kind of, you know, spells out in a weird footnote in the Inquisition book, is, you know, if you believe in this medievalist view of history that it repeats, and, you know, and that there are these patterns that are almost theologically unavoidable, it's predicated on the idea that humankind is essentially evil, right? And so it's also tragic that in that quest, that's the conclusion that he came to. And so I felt some responsibility not just to document that, but also because I found it interesting.
Hi. My question would be, besides you having to compare yourself to Philip Roth in such contexts, do you often find yourself in the situation of Professor Blum in the closing scene of the novel, where he justifies for the sheriff just saying it's just a bunch of crazy Turks? Do you find yourself having to justify the Netanyahus or the Netanyahu, the contemporary one, to the world while you talk to non-Jewish or non-Israeli audiences about the novel, given all the balagan that comes out about the Netanyahu family and what's going on in Israel nowadays?
No, they'd have to pay me for that. Yeah, I'm not going to do any hasbara for free. I don't know. No, I don't. I mean, I'm far less, you know, meek or scared than that generation is in the book. You know, I mean, I recognize that Blum generation in the book because they were scared, right? I mean, they didn't want to be identified with this stuff, you know, and, you know, the idea of someone writing, I don't know what the equivalent would be to the Netanyahu in the 1950s, but if like someone was going to write a book called like, you know, The Herzls, which talk about a really fucked up family. The Herzls are pretty interesting, you know? But, you know, like, I don't know that they would do that. It would, you know, it would be to put a target on your back in their minds. And, you know, and for me, I don't feel that way. And I often think about why I don't feel that way. Whether I don't feel intimidated or scared like that because of American assimilation. I don't think that's the case. I think I actually feel that way because of Israel, which is the weird contradiction. It's that, in a way, that, you know, that entity is, you know, in a way it's a legitimating force for concerns like this, in my mind at least. And so I don't feel like I go around justifying why I'm interested in it, but I feel like I go around being unafraid about saying why I'm interested in it, because, you know, in a way, being a state satisfies non-Jews' requirements. You know? Like, it's a weird thing about, like, it's an official culture, it's an official state, it's an official thing. I'm always surprised by how much that official existence grants a sense of interest and legitimacy, whereas it's, you know, it's just a culture, which happens to be far older than the state, you know? It somehow is something that you feels that you apologize for. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Josh and Björn. Just wanted to say, I don't know if anyone knows who Jabotinsky was, and the revisionist movement to turn out later on to the Likud party, which is now Benjamin Netanyahu's party, as opposed to the Labor Party. They were rivals. So the Likud was Menachem Begin's party, and now, anyway. So about Ricky's question and Benzion Netanyahu's career and the dwelling on it, I agree, it's super important because it really explains a lot of the resentiments now in Israel, because not only that he was rejected as an intellectual, and he was, some say an important intellectual, or at least, as you mentioned, Joshua, his research was different and is worth reading. But also his son's resentment of elitism stems exactly from the father's feeling shun out of the Israeli academia. And I think this is something that he inherited his sons. And what Benjamin Netanyahu is, at least I think, or many of you know, is fighting now, you see, is really the dismantling of what he calls elitism. I'm not going to give a psychological analysis, but a lot of it comes from the father, Benzion, and that's why it was very important that you wrote about it in your book. About the American Jewry and Philip Roth, we are here a lot of times celebrating, actually, not only Philip Roth, but the whole generation of immigrants who came to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century and who not only assimilated and became part of the cultural canon of America and stayed Jews, not Orthodox Jews, but they stayed Jews. Of course, a lot of them changed their names. We are celebrating that. And of course, that explains why Philip Roth, who was born in 1933, would belong to that. As you say, his grandparents were born there. I mean, he did not have a reason to write about the Holocaust, not like Salinger. Of course, that's another case. While your generation, Josh, and also your generation in Sweden is much more inclined to deal with these type of topics and about the Holocaust. We see it everywhere. But a final thing before we go out to the book signing, tell us a bit about your background. You were born to an Orthodox or religious family, and you left or decided to take the kippah off at one point. Is that something that you want to talk about, or is it too private?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you want to FaceTime them?
Yes,
you can
exactly.
Put them up, and it's probably, I don't know what time it is. We can say hi.
It's just interesting. In just a second is something.
You can have my mom explain it. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I grew up and going to yeshiva and going to the schools and but you know it's also a you know I didn't leave it to like you know become a pig butcher. I left it to become a writer. You know, like it's not, you know what I'm saying? Like I'm not, they were okay with that. Now, if I had, you know, not had any success as a writer, maybe that would be a problem. But that would probably be a problem for them regardless of their religious beliefs. I think, you know, yeah, is the question of like, how did that influence me or just how did I grow up? I mean, you know, it was a tiny island off the coast of New Jersey. There's a yeshiva on it, you know, probably 200 students or something like that, maybe, you know, 12 students a grade. We did a few years of school in Israel as part of the schooling. And in retrospect, I think it was a very, you know, it was actually, it was a good education for someone who knows how to teach themselves.
Thanks. And of course, one thing it gave you, I think, before we go, is this fantastic language that you have, and fantastic knowledge about Jewish resources, and you know, and I think that also comes from your background. So I say it in a positive way, of course. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Björn. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you outside.